Welcome to the Avid Readers of Christian Fiction podcast, where the pages of faith and storytelling meet. Hosted by me, Trisha Goyer. If you're one of the over 28,000 avid readers who are part of our online Facebook group, welcome. If you're not, come and join us, and you are welcome too. If you cherish Christian fiction, this is your haven. Together, we'll embark on a journey through the rich landscapes of Christian literature, engaging in heart-filled conversations with the authors who pen our favorite stories. From uncovering new titles that promise to captivate your heart and mind, to sharing the reads that have touched our souls, this podcast is a celebration of the stories that inspire faith, hope, and love. Whether you're looking for your next book to curl up with or seeking to deepen your understanding of faith through fiction, you found the right place. Let's turn the page on this adventure together, exploring the depth and breadth of Christian fiction, one book at a time. Welcome and happy reading. Well, hello friends, Trisha Goyer here, and I am so excited to tell you about a book that I will say I listened to the audiobook in 2 days. I did a lot of yard work. I did a lot of cooking. I did anything that could take me away from my desk and actually finish listening to the book. So first of all, let me welcome Ann Gabhart. And welcome. I'm so glad you're here. And why don't you just start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Well, it's great to be here to talk to you, Tricia. And there's not a lot to say about me. I'm just grew up a farm girl, still live on a farm here in the middle of Kentucky. I love writing books that have Kentucky settings, and I don't live in the Appalachian Mountains, but I have enjoyed going there to find some stories. I've been married forever. Uh, Longer than I want to
I love
admit.
that.
I have three adult kids, and they're all happily married, thank goodness, and have 9 grandkids, 2 ornery dogs. Well, 1 ornery dog and 1 not so ornery dog. They're both sleeping right now, and I hope they stay asleep. We'll see.
I just had one scratching at my door to come in my office, so I let him in, so hopefully he'll be good too. Okay, let's just talk about Mira. Mira is her life changes literally in a moment, and then we start in the beginning of the book where she's getting a marriage proposal that she never thought she would wake up that day and get a marriage proposal. First of all, just tell us about. We'll start with this character, and then we'll go into the story. But how did you get this idea for Mira's journey? And yeah, tell us where the book came from. And the book is The Song of Sourwood Mountain.
Well, originally, when I had the idea, I wanted to write about a mission teacher. That's something that happened a lot in the
Mm.
Appalachian Mountains. But when I started doing research, I realized that most mission teachers were not married. They were single women and they never married. And I wanted a little romance in my book. So I remembered that once upon a time, a long time ago, I had read this story about a couple that started a mission in the mountains together. And he was the preacher and she was the teacher. So I thought, well, maybe I can have that kind of situation for my mission teacher. And so I decided Mira needed to be married before she went. And she was a spinster school teacher. At that time, you may not know this, but at that time, uh, female teachers, if they got married, were forced to quit because they had to go home and be a husband,
Mhm.
and a wife and a mother. So I decided we'd change that up a little too and make it different for a mountain mission so that I could let Mira get married. And in the first line of the book, it does say that Mira Dean did not know when she went to church that morning that before she got home for lunch or dinner, I think I said, she would have a marriage proposal. So that pretty much threw it into the story. And of course, Mira thinks that the marriage proposal is ludicrous, ridiculous. She hasn't seen this man for 5 years. They did go to school together. And so she thinks this is the craziest thing that she's ever heard. But, sometimes God pushes us along on this trail or that trail, and she gets pushed a little toward making a decision that she never thought she would make.
Yeah, she got pushed in many ways. My favorite push though was from the landlord, who had to be her landlord had to be one of my favorite characters in the book, and she almost literally pushed her that way. So, where did you come up with some of these other characters?
Well, Miss Ophelia sort of took on a more of a part in the book than maybe I had thought when I first came up with her name. But Mira needed somebody to guide her and open up her eyes to the possibilities. And of course, Miss Ophelia had passed up some of those possibilities in her young life, and she was sort of trying to get Mira not to do the same. And Gordon was an interesting, a very devout preacher. He was a man that
Mhm.
Mira would have never thought when she knew him as a boy in school that he would ever be a preacher, but that happens a lot. You meet people that you would think, oh, that one person was never meant to be a preacher, but if God calls him or her, then they change and can follow the route that the Lord wants for them to do.
I love it. And so Gordon is a mission preacher, and the Lord places it upon his heart as he sees Mira walking in that day that that needs to be his bride and the school teacher for where he's at. And I loved that it was in her point of view. And then it was also in his point of view because they were having two different conversations in their internal thoughts. He was determined that she was going to be his wife and had faith, and she that was the absolute last thing that she wanted to do. And I think right from the beginning, the characters were so easy to love, both of them. Even as stubborn as Mira was, you could see like this was a big shakeup from everything that she knew, and then bad goes to worse in her life. But Gordon, I mean, he is devout. He wants to follow God. He believes God told him that this is supposed to be his wife, and he is determined.
Well, he had already had experiences in my mind that other times when God had nudged him to do this or that. And I really think that when he actually made the proposal, he was almost as surprised as Mira to begin with. But he felt
Hmm.
the need to be married uh, that he hadn't even realized he needed that need. But that's sometimes the way God can answer the desires of our hearts, sometimes when we aren't even real clear what those desires might be.
Yes, that's so good. Okay, so there's another point of view character. Tell us a little bit about her because she is a little sweet ragamuffin, and you just ache for her, but also love her little gutsiness. So tell us about this other third point of view character that you have in the book.
Well, Ada June was actually inspired by her name. Uh, our little church, I go to a little country church, and our little church has a prayer list. And on our prayer list, we have an Ada June, a different last name. And when I saw that name, for some reason, it was just like, I guess, God nudging Gordon to make that proposal. I just knew I had to write a character named Ada June, and I thought that's a good mountain name. Mountain people like a double name a lot of times, Betty Jean or two names together, Bobby Joe. But I like the name Ada June. I knew that Ada June would be a character that needed a family, and of course, one of Mira's
Hmm.
desires of her heart was to have a family, but after the man that she expected to marry died of tuberculosis, she thought that that dream was lost forever. But when she goes to the mountain, sometimes you find family in the oddest places. Ada June is an orphan. She doesn't know who her father was. She never had a father. Her mother never told her about her father. Her mother has died about 5 years before this story starts, when Ada June was 5. And since then, Ada June's sort of been passed around from one family to the other. The mountain people do take care of their own, but sometimes they give a kid a hard time too. And Ada June was not the easiest child to tend to. After her mother died, she wouldn't talk. She could talk, but she wouldn't talk to anybody. She finally started talking to a few people, and even throughout the book, she still has that problem with being able to talk to other people. So she was a very fun character. She stole my heart while I was writing about her. She has a dog too. That
Oh,
helped because I'm a dog lover, and
Bo.
I like sticking the dog in my story. And I thought Ada June needed a dog to love her, so that she could have somebody that she knew loved her.
Yes, Bo definitely took care of her too. You don't cross Ada Joe because or Ada June because he is going to get in the way if you try to do that. Okay, so we this is set in 1910 and do you say Appalachian? How do you say it the right way?
Appalachian. It's not Appalachia. It's
Appalachian Mountain.
Appalachian. You've latched the door, I think.
App okay, Appalachian Mountains in 1910 and we think I mean, there's a lot back then that it's not the same, just electricity wasn't common, but this is in the holler, which you don't say holla. Is it holla? How do you say it?
Holla. You would say holla if you're
Yeah.
educated or not in the mountains. In the mountains, you say holler.
Yeah, holler. So up in the holler, um, things are very meager. I loved, well, this is getting ahead of myself, but the wedding, we won't go too much. I can't give too much of the book away, but the wedding gifts. The wedding gifts literally brought tears to my eyes what these women brought for wedding gifts. I'm not giving too much away because this is a romance and historical novel. But once I think we got up to um Gordon's house and the cabin and the people and the serenade. There's so many things. We're so just I fell in love with the place. I fell in love. It was so interesting. It was so different. So just give us, I mean, we don't want to give too much of the story away, but give us a glimpse of what it was like in that time up in the mountains in 1910.
Well, I've already written a couple of books set in the mountains. I wrote a couple of books with Frontier Nursing Service, with nurse midwives that went up to cabins and delivered babies. And actually, that was more close to the 1930s and 1940s. So things were still like
Mhm.
that because some of the midwives delivered babies with the chickens running around in the cabin. So it was still, they just didn't have many conveniences. You didn't have running water, you didn't have indoor facilities. Sometimes like my Mira has to learn how to cook in a fireplace. Now, to me, I could figure out how to haul water and I could figure out how to light a lamp, but the cooking in a fireplace just seems like it would be really difficult. And one of the scenes has her saying that she's not sure she knows can make cornbread, and Ada June is just flabbergasted that somebody might not be able to make cornbread. So that's a staple up in the mountains is to have some cornbread and beans. So it just was I've sort of lived rough in my younger days, so I knew how to do without some of those things, and I was able to write it into the story. Now, I did live in a log cabin, but it was had been turned into a farmhouse by the time I lived in it, so it wasn't where you could see the logs. But it's a different lifestyle. Even then, it there wasn't a lot. You couldn't get there very easy and you couldn't leave very easy. And that was one
Mhm.
reason that there wasn't schools because the kids couldn't get to a school unless they could walk to the school. And if there wasn't one close enough to walk, they were pretty much out of luck about having a chance to learn or go to school. It just was a different lifestyle, especially for Mara, who had lived in a city and had those conveniences in a street right outside her door and people actually driving cars. And now she's in a place where everything's horse and buggy or horse, maybe not even buggies there. So, or they go shankmare, which is mountain for on foot.
Yes. I loved all the terms. So you just mentioned like that. I mean, there's so many terms that And see, I love that Gordon had to explain it to Mira because it also explains it to the reader what these or the kids. Sometimes Joseph, which is another little sweet boy in the story, or Ada June, they would explain things to her, and you're actually explaining things to the reader because Mira was an outsider, and so it gave us a hint of what was happening. But also, the sense of community is something that we don't have today. They didn't always all get along perfectly, but they all cared and had to help each other because that's the way things went. And so I love how the story it was reminiscent of um a little bit of Little House on the Prairie just from the community aspect, but also kind of like Christie and Up in the Mountains. But I just was fascinated again. I listened to the whole audiobook in 2 days and my kids kept trying to talking to me and I kept having to stop the book and like, yes. I'm sorry. I'm in another time right now. So I just really fell in love because then you have to find out what happens. And I don't want to give too much away, but there's some pretty exciting things, and you just have to keep listening to see what's going to happen with these characters.
Well,
So you did a great job with it, and then it's just so lyrical too. There's just a
yeah.
nice, easy tone. You could hear the rhythm of the voices in the conversation as I read.
Well, I haven't listened to the audio. I knew it was out on audio, but I love audiobooks, but I don't always listen to my own audiobooks. I've actually narrated 3 or 4 of mine that didn't get a professional contract. So I enjoyed that part too.
Now, and one thing that I loved was I was just felt like I was so swept away and completely in that setting. I just felt like I was there. So maybe for those, and I know you've had this setting in some of your other books, but for those who aren't familiar with the setting, tell us about what it is like in that part of Kentucky.
Well, the Appalachian region is sort of isolated, especially back in 1910 when I wrote this book, and even later in the middle of the century when I was writing about the Frontier Nurses Service. People were still living in cabins, still didn't have any contact much with the outside world. In 1910, my little hollow that I call it Sourwood Holler was pretty much isolated, and the only way you could get there was just sort of going through the country. And they used creeks a lot of times for their roadways,
Mm.
and you couldn't get there in a car. If you'd had a car, you couldn't get there in it. Sometimes they just had to go everywhere by foot. They called that Shanksmere, which meant without a horse. But the richer people probably had horses and were able to go with a horse. But a lot of people just walked. They didn't have running
Mm.
water. They didn't have electricity. They had to cook in the fireplace. They did have stoves at that time, but most of the people were not able to have a cook stove. For one thing, it would have been hard to get there. Now, Mira's school, when she opened her school, did have a stove where they could have heat in their schoolhouse. So they did have sometimes have a stove if they didn't have a fireplace. But the fireplaces were in most of the cabins, and that was pretty much where they gathered around to do their chores or to do their tasks. The women would do their sewing at the fireplace, and kids, if they could read, would be doing their homework there or they're reading their books. It was a much different world than the city where Mira had lived previously, where she had
Hmm.
cars right out the window and electricity and not a great stove to cook on, but a little paraffin stove that she could cook on.
And I think back then, like that was all they knew. So they didn't really know any different. Like my grandma, well, she's not back in 1910, but my grandma was born in 1929 and her family was immigrants from Mexico and they lived in a boxcar that they turned into a house, just like the books, the boxcar. And, they had a little stove. They had a little trundle bed for her and her 2 brothers that went under her parents' bed, but that's all they had was a boxcar with an outhouse. And I'm like, Grandma, what was it like? And she's like, that's all we knew. It's not like they felt like they were missing out or when she got older she was more aware of the world, but I think sometimes we think, oh, that must have been so hard, but it's if it's that's what and that's familiar, and You have your community and you know how things work in that world. That's kind of how things are.
Well, people, make do, that I was
Yeah.
amazed when I was writing my other books about the frontier nurse midwives, and they would go up into the mountains and deliver babies, and some of the families had, like, 15 children, but they would really only have a two-room cabin with a loft, and you just, think about how you would put 15 kids to bed in a two-room cabin. But, I didn't deal with that as much in this book, I mean, because, of course, Mira didn't have children when she got there, so she didn't have to worry about that part, and she actually had a two-room cabin, which was pretty much a luxury in that area.
Absolutely. Now, I would love to just hear a little bit about your writing journey. When did you start writing, and then how did you decide that these were the type of novels that you wanted to write?
Well, actually, I began writing when I was about 10 years old. I liked to read Hardy Boy books, and I thought it'd be fun to solve a mystery like the Hardy Boys. I wanted to be a Hardy girl, not a Hardy boy, but wasn't much chance that was
Hmm.
going to happen on my little farm out in the country. So I decided to write one myself, starring a much cuter, much less shy, much smarter little girl than I actually was. My sister and my cousin were my sidekicks, and we had a lot of fun with it. I was writing with a pen and a wire-bound notebook. But I got a little older and started writing little short stories when I was a teenager that nobody in his right mind would ever want to read. I got married very young, had 2 kids by the time I was 19, but I never lost the desire to be a writer. I knew that's what I wanted to do from the time I knew that somebody was responsible for those words in the books I loved. So I took a little correspondence course so that I could open up the world of writing because I didn't know any writers. I had no idea how to begin, and so I found an agent, through sent a book in, and my third book actually found a publisher with Warner Books long back in 1978, a long, long time ago. Then I've gone up mountains and down in the valleys some. I went through some years of rejections and kept writing.
Hmm.
Finally, I decided I'd write one more book. I would write one more book that just meant what I wanted to write about, not worry about what the market might want. And so I've always heard you're supposed to write what you know. I knew little communities, I knew a little small church. So I wrote a book about a bivocational preacher and his family, and mostly the 14, 13-year-old girl is the main character in the book. That book actually found a loving editor in the Christian market, and I had looked at the Christian market, but didn't think maybe my books would fit in the Christian market. But obviously, I love the Christian market, and I'm so glad that I got started in Revell Books and that they have published. I think this one might be the 24th or 25th book of mine they've published. So it's been a good journey, and it's a great publishing company. I really like putting in the faith journey in with my characters.
Hmm.
I like coming up with the characters, and sometimes there's more faith journey than in others. Of course, with having a preacher, like I do in the Song of Sourwood Mountain, it's easy to sneak some Christian Bible verses and stories into books when you have a preacher you're writing about. But I've enjoyed being able to have that. Seems like the Lord sometimes just inspires the right spot to drop in a little Christian message in a story.
Hmm. I love that. And I think let's talk about the faith journey because at the beginning, Gordon had very strong faith. He felt the Lord speaking to him that Myra was supposed to be his wife. She had no faith, but then his faith wavered as he worried. Is she truly going to love him? And what if what it was the wrong thing bringing this city girl up and in these mountains and all the things. So I loved, and then her faith grew, and then she struggled, and then it grew. I mean, I love that the faith journeys weren't just one direction. There's ups and there's downs, which I think is true of all of us in life. And I think that's another reason why we could relate to these books, because we see that one day you're like you have all the faith, And one day you have no faith and you wonder if you made the right decision of all. So, do you feel like that's important as you're sharing the faith journeys of your characters?
Well, I think, the way you describe it, it sounds very important, but,
Mhm.
I don't know that I think a lot about it as I go. My characters just sort of come to life for me, and,
Mm.
I just get involved in their what is happening to them, and the faith journey or whatever happens sort of just comes through the, uh, whatever events are happening to them. I do think that most of us do have our ups and downs, even if our faith is rock solid. Uh, it doesn't always go the way we think it maybe should.
Mhm.
Everybody has some times when it's not as easy. So I like being my characters to be as real as I can make them. So
Yeah.
if if that happens, then I've done my job.
Yes. And I told you before we started recording, this is the first book that I read of yours. And you're like, well, that's a shame. And I'm like, I agree. That is a shame because I enjoyed this so much. So, for maybe there's a listener out there that also hasn't read some of your books, I first of all, I highly recommend this one. I mean, this is going to be on the top of my favorite reads of this year, and I read a lot of books. I read at least a couple a week, so this is right up there as one of my favorites of the year, The Song of Sourwood Mountain. But for those like myself who want to know more, what are some other titles that we can go and look at?
Well, that first book that I talked about the preacher and his family, is actually called "The Scent of Lilacs," and
Mm.
it's based a little bit on what I remember the 1960s being like. And then I have three books, all in that one year, set in Holly Hill, that I've based on my little town of Lawrenceburg. So that's a really familiar story for me. And then I wrote another series of stories about the same characters. It's based on my mom's memories of growing up in
Wow.
the Depression era. Those are my Rosie Corner
Mhm.
stories. And Angel Sister, probably one of my most read books, was the first one of it. And then Small Town Girl and Love Comes Home. Then I've written 8 books set in my fictional Shaker village. The Shakers were a very unusual group. They did not believe in marriage, they believed in living as sisters and brothers. They did some amazing inventions, they did amazing crafts. They believed in working with their hands was part of worship. They also danced in their worship. So they were a very unusual group, and they didn't believe in romance, so in all my books, I had to sneak romance in the back door, and my characters had to stop being Shakers before the end of the book because you couldn't stay there and have any romance going on. Since then, I've written a lot of standalone books. I did write the ones about the Frontier Nursing Service that are set up in the Appalachian area. Really enjoyed learning about Mary Breckenridge and the Frontier Nursing Service. She made such a difference to the people in that community. She saved so many lives of babies that it just was an amazing
Mm.
bit of history to read. And that's These Healing Hills and An Appalachian Summer. Then I wrote a book about the Pack Horse Librarian. It's also set in the
Oh my
Appalachian
goodness.
Mountains. I've been when I started writing again after I'd had several years of not being able to sell at my age, I decided I would just sort of write what I wanted and not necessarily be stuck in one idea or one theme. So I've sort of jumped around a little. Some of them actually had three cozy mysteries too that were set in Hidden Springs. So those are the only contemporary books I have right now, and I based them on my little town here in Lawrenceburg too. So, but I called it Hidden Springs because Lawrenceburg just doesn't have the same sound to it for a name. But I've had a lot of fun with that. I wrote a book about the cholera epidemic set in Springfield, based on a true story. I
Mm.
wrote a book of set just on the farm about two orphan girls that they were my inspiration, because When the Meadow Blooms. And then the last book before this one was set on a showboat on the river, on the Ohio River, called In the Shadow of the River. So the next book, I'm just going to have one name for the title, maybe Blue or Red or something. I think Red's been done. I'll have to do a different one. But it's a lot to write out those titles when you have four long
Oh,
words in
yeah.
them. But
Yes.
Sourwood Mountain's
Well,
a good title.
it is. It is. Are you working on another book right now?
I just turned one into my editor. It's again not a little different. It's set in a Springs hotel in the 1800s, the first part of the 1800s. There were a lot of Springs hotels here in Kentucky where people would go to take the water to cure
Oh,
their
yeah.
arthritis, their rheumatism, or heaven only knows what they thought it might cure. But they also thought sometimes that it might cure being a spinster, that they had plenty of available men to get married. And so they had dances every night because the one I picked was actually a real place at Graham Springs. And the gentleman that owned it was a amazing individual, lived to be 104 years old. So it was an interesting research. But my character needs to get married, so that's the reason she has gone there, not to get a cure for anything, but the fact that she needs to be married.
Cure for her singleness, then.
Right.
Well, I have a
So
lot of reading to do, let me tell you, to catch up with all those. The Pack Horse Librarian, that sounds amazing. Let me just say right there.
that title is Along a Storied Trail, and it was a fun
Oh,
book. I really enjoyed reading about how the women took the books up on horseback. It was like a horseback bookmobile during the Depression era, and
oh, so fun.
a lot of fun to read about that, the storytelling and so forth. I like sticking in a little storytelling in my mountain books because that's an important part of mountain life. I didn't
Yes.
realize that there was actually a Song of Sourwood Mountain until a reader told me about it after it came out, or I would have stuck a little of that Song of Sourwood Mountain in my book somewhere. But all I know about it
Do you
is the
know? Do you
first
have it
line.
there?
The first line is "Chickens are crowing on Sourwood Mountain," and that's the only line I know. But you can look it up online. It's a lot of readers said they learned it in school, like you might learn "Mary Had a Little Lamb" song, when they were having music in school. But I don't remember ever hearing it until
Oh,
now.
I love that. I loved when I'm just gonna give it a little piece. It's not giving too much of the book away. One, I think Mira started singing the ABCs, explaining how songs can teach kids, and the some of the women were confused, and another woman had to explain that that was the alphabet put into song, and so it was
Right.
so cute. Yeah.
Well, if you hadn't ever learned to read, you might not realize
Yeah.
what the ABCs were all about.
I know, I loved it. It was just like, oh, I love this book so much. Okay, so all that to say, definitely go and check out all of Anne's books. But Anne, where can people go find more information about you and all of your books?
I have a website, www.annhgabhart.com, and without an E. Um, it's got all my books on there. There's usually, I think all of them have a first chapter or a little bit of the book there you can read, and you can read about the books. And you read about me, and I have a blog that I post on twice a week on Facebook. I love talking to people on Facebook, and I do Instagram. I tweet a little. You can't say Twitter anymore,
Look at
X, whatever it
you.
is.
Yeah.
But I don't tweet as much as I Facebook.
Yes. Well,
I,
again, the book is A Song of Sourwood Mountain. So, Anne Gabhart, Anne, thank you so much for being here today.
a great place if people are interested in getting a copy is the Baker Book House, but it's also available
Yes.
on online places, and you can get the audio, obviously, since Tricia has listened to it. You can get it in large print sometime too, but it's not hard to find my books if you got an internet.
I love it. Well, thank you so much, Ann.
Well, thank you, Tricia, for having me over. I enjoyed talking to you.